Adventures of the Decepticons Pet Ghost by Played Crowd 5610. Part 3 of Hunting the Nemesis. Chapter 12, Bed Rest. Summary. After the events of accidental medical assistance required, Knockout decides to put Danny on bed rest, but Danny has other plans. Danny's been put on bed rest, and he was not happy about it. He couldn't believe it, and surprisingly, it was Knockout who had been the one to try to ensure Danny took care of himself. According to this information, Knockout gestured to the screen behind him that displayed diagrams of human biology and notes that he had accumulated over the last day. And what the human medic insisted, he rolled his optics. Humans need rest to heal properly after sustaining significant injuries, such as yours. Without it, they risk worsening their condition, so until you are healed, you will need to remain under constant Decepticon surveillance. Danny stared, slack-jawed, perched on the edge of the medical booth. Starscream stood on the other side of the med bay, with his arms crossed as he listened. You can't be serious. I don't need to be babysat. I'm fine. This sort of thing happens all the time, Danny argues. The human medic was very clear that rest is essential. Well, and she was not scared out of her mind, anyway. Knockout replied, optics narrowing with a touch of expiration. And as the Decepticon chef, physician, only physician, Starscream muttered. Knockout continued, ignoring the commander. It's my job to ensure the health of those on the ship. Danny would have appreciated the care that Knockout seemed to be showing him if it wasn't for the fact that Danny didn't need babysitting. Danny scoffed, throwing his hands up in disbelief. Since when do you listen to humans? I know my limits. It's not that bad. He paused, frustration filling his field. And I'm not a Decepticon. You can't just order me around. Starscream's optics flickered as he stepped forward, his tone sharp, but with an undertone Danny could almost mistake for concern. If your health is at risk, you will listen to Knockout. Danny glared over his shoulder, eyes narrowing at Starscream. You never follow orders when you're on bed rest. You can't make me stay here. He snapped. Knockout rolled his optics dramatically. Yes, we can. Until your injuries heal, you are to... He glanced at the notes on his monitor. Then he didn't know if they were from the internet or from the human nurse explaining to the mech while Danny was unconscious. Reduce stimulus activities such as stretching, running, walking, and maintaining as much rest as possible. You are to also remain in calm, non-stressful situation. Right, because living on a Decepticon warship in the middle of a war is so stress-free. Danny couldn't help but laugh, though the motion made him wince as pain flared across his torso. He clutched his side, and Knockout raised an optic wrench, while Starscream looked Danny up and down, wings flickering with concern. Knockout let out an extravagant sigh. Doctor's orders. Starscream, take him, he said, waving a service dismissively behind him. I need to clean up my lab after the organic mess you left behind. Knockout shuddered. Danny opened his mouth to protest, but Starscream scooped him up with both servers before he could get a word out. The Seeker moved carefully, making sure he didn't move Danny too quickly and accidentally strain his injuries. Danny sighed as Starscream carried him out of the med bay. He was now stuck with a crew of 20-something-foot-tall, battle-hardened babysitters who wouldn't even let him walk on his own. It was going to be a long week. Danny was already bored, and it had only been 2 hours. Usually, he would be perfectly fine sitting around in Starscream's quarters while the con went over datapads, but the fact that he had to stay there because the con said so made him want to explore more than ever. Danny waited on a few painstaking minutes, glancing around at his personal shelf. More and more personal items seemed to be added each month. Sometimes he would find extra things placed in with his belongings that he hadn't had before, things he was sure Starscream must have picked up on his little missions. He noticed that Starscream was a hoarder, but the Seeker kept everything maliciously organized, and enjoyed collecting little gifts or souvenirs. Danny was confident that if he ever asked Starscream where the items came from, the con would either ignore him or deny everything. The thought made Danny smile to himself, but he was still bored and salty about being put on bed rest. He was sitting on the old beanbag, already having tossed one of the miniature data pads haphazardly to the floor. Soundwave had a few extra in storage, and Danny had no idea why the con had miniature data pads, but he wasn't complaining. He rolled his head back and stared at the ceiling. He needed to stretch his legs. He glanced up to ensure Starscream was still hard at work, and he was. Then he stood up, slowly, taking care not to tear his stitches, and walked to the edge. His steps were silent as he kept his eyes on Starscream and jumped off the shelf, floating safely to the ground. Once on the ground, then he headed for the door. He felt the pull at his stitches with every step, making him wince. But freedom was worth the pain. He only had about 20 more steps to go until suddenly Starscream's large heel Petey slammed down in front of him. Then he stumbled back and looked up, meeting Starscream's growl. Then he returned the expression and crossed his arms. "I was just stretching my legs," he tried. Starscream snooped down and snatched Danny up without a second thought. "I believe stretching and walking were both on knockouts not for the human list." The con said briskly, striding back to his desk instead of placing Danny back on his shelf. Starscream set him next to the datapad on the desk and sat down to continue his work. Danny frowned. "Right, and now I have nowhere comfortable to rest," he muttered, crossing his arms. Starscream barely looked up. "You should have thought of that before trying to escape," he said, swiping on his datapad. Then he rolled his eyes and sat down on the cold, hard desk. He noticed Starscream glaring at him a few times, each look more annoyed than the last. Then he wasn't even doing anything. Abruptly, the Seeker stood up and walked to the other side of the room where Danny's shelf was. Then he stood up to see better and walked to the edge of the desk. Starscream turned on his heel and brought back Danny's beanbag, blanket, and one of the datapads. Starscream glanced down at Danny near the edge and used his service to push him back to the middle of the desk, likely assuming Danny was trying to escape again. The con promptly dropped the items next to Danny and sat down to resume his work. Then he bundled the items together to create a comfortable sitting spot and smiled at the con, who kept periodically glancing over as if to make sure Danny was still there. "Thanks," Danny said. Starscream ignored him, but then he could see his wings twitch in acknowledgement. It was the next day, and it was time for another escape attempt. Danny was sitting on the counter with Breakdown and Knockout in the room. He had been told to stay put, but there was no way he was going to listen. His wounds had healed more, and the pain was bearable. He was perfectly fine to start walking around now. He glanced up as Breakdown and Knockout were thoughtfully distracted by each other, Knockout fussing over a new dig or scratch in his pain, and Breakdown trying to calm him down and help buff it out. An exhausting experience, from the looks of it. Even though it was entertaining to watch the two scramble like that, Danny had some escape to do, and this distraction was perfect. He quickly jumped off the counter, landed softly on the floor, and headed for the door. Instead of almost getting stepped on this time, he made it, and the door opened easily for him. Luckily, the hiss of the door hydraulics was quiet enough not to alert the two mechs. Then he made it down 2 hallways before a large tentacle wrapped around his torso and lifted him into the air. Then he let out a surprised yelp as he looked around to see who or what had grabbed him, only to meet Soundwave's visor. "Oh hey!" Then he laughed, rubbing the back of his neck. "What are you doing out here, Soundwave? I thought you'd be in the control room." Soundwave tilted his head and the security footage of the medbay flicked onto the screen, showing Danny's escape attempt. Danny sighed and slumped. Soundwave raised both servers, placed Danny into them, and retracted his tentacles. Danny sat down in the servers with his legs to the side. Soundwave spoke up. "Statement. Danny is injured. Statement. Knockout has placed Danny on bed rest until further notice. Observation. Danny is not abiding by the rules." If Danny could see the con's optics, he was sure he'd be getting a disappointing glare. "I'm fine," Danny drew his hands up in expiration. "Really, you guys are worrying over nothing." "Incorrect." Danny stared up at the con. "Soundwave and the Decepticons. Concern for your well-being." Danny almost died without intervention. Then he felt a pang of guilt. He really had almost died. The con were just trying to help in their own way. But then he sighed. "Fine, I will rest," he relented. Soundwave flashed a smile emoji on his visor and started walking back towards the control room. Then he looked up at him, confused. "And I'm not going to the medbay?" Soundwave glanced down. "Negative. Breakdown and knockout, proven insignificant at guarding you." Soundwave and Laserbeak, superior. Danny laughed and leaned back in Soundwave's service. Needless to say, the next time Danny was put under Knockout's and Breakdown's care, he found himself placed in a large glass observation tank to minimize any escape attempts. It was something that would easily contain an average human. Not Danny, of course, but Knockout didn't know that, and at least it was comfortable. Knockout had looked so proud of himself when he set Danny in there, too. If Danny hadn't been so tired, he would have tried to escape the moment the con turned around, just to prove a point. But for now he leaned back on the blankets that had been placed inside the tank with him. This wasn't so bad. Danny managed to escape from Knockout 2 more times, and now Soundwave had transferred Danny's care to some of the Venticons whenever Soundwave and Starscream were unable to watch him. Danny didn't mind. He loved the Venticons. Then he glanced up at Rhodey, who had him clutched in his service as he and C-27 patrolled the ship hallways. C-27 was always a stickler for the rules, while Rhodey tended to be a troublemaker. The two were often put on shifts together to make sure that they kept each other balanced, or at least so C-27 could keep Rhodey in line. Rhodey was always excited to see Danny, jumping at every opportunity to pick up the human and ask him questions. C-27 always seemed snippy around Danny and would tell Rhodey off for harassing him. C-27 cared about Danny and Rhodey in his own way. He didn't want either of them hurt, but he masked this behind his professionalism and strict rule-following. As they walked, Danny shifted in Rhodey's hold a little too quickly, sending a sharp pain shooting through his side. He hissed and grabbed at the injury reflexively. Both cons stopped immediately, alarms barking in their fields. "Are you okay?" Rhodey's tone, usually light and playful, was now serious and tied with worry. "Did I hurt you?" No. "I'm fine, just moved too quickly." Danny waved them off. C-27 leveled his visors at Danny. "If you're experiencing any excess pain, we are instructed to take you to Knockout for an examination," the con informed him. Danny sighed. "Really, guys? I'm fine, see?" Danny smiled brightly and stood up on Rhodey's servers, who promptly used his other servers to cup around him to make sure he didn't fall. He was met with more flat looks and concerned feels. "Okay, if it happens again you can take me to the med bay, okay?" The two cons glanced at each other and decided that it was a good enough compromise. "Fine," C-27 reluctantly agreed. "But if you feel any more pain, just tell us, okay?" Rhodey said. Danny smiled up at them. "Promise." They continued their patrol. Light commentary passing between them, mainly between Danny and Rhodey, as C-27 tried to remain professional, but Danny could tell he enjoyed the conversation, not to mention the company. Needless to say, after all of that, Danny never ended up being able to escape. Now his injuries were finally healed enough to be taken off bed rest, no longer in need for constant supervision. He was still told to keep an eye on his injuries, but he was free to do what he wanted. But now that Danny had the choice, he still wanted to hang with the cons all day anyway.